very strong and they don't last very long. And then we're on that path of accumulation, we keep meditating on emptiness still, keep accumulating merit, doing a lot of virtuous activities, helping others. But as I think briefly mentioned already, is that we have Shamatha and Vipassana. So Shamatha, we have the calm, clear mind. But then when we do the Vipassana practice of emptiness and we start to investigate, that investigation can like destabilize the Shamatha. So often what we have to do is sort of go backwards and forwards. We have to alternate. If the mind becomes too unstable through the investigation, we stop, go back to Shamatha, then back again. So we alternate. And we're even doing that on the path of accumulation. But then, towards the end of that, what we find is that the Vipassana practice investigating emptiness doesn't destabilize our Shamatha, it enhances it. And then Shamatha and Vipassana become unified. And we saw that in the Shamatha chart, the Vipassana practice here, that number at the top here of the Shamatha chart, remember it said, the root of samsara is cut by the union of Shamatha and Vipassana observing emptiness. So at the end of this path of accumulation, we see number 4, and number 4 says union of Shamatha and Vipassana observing emptiness. So now they become unified, meaning that the Vipassana practice doesn't destabilize the Shamatha, they become unified. And so that marks the entry point to the second stage of the path, called path of preparation. The word preparation here means we are now preparing for our first direct realization of emptiness. So on the path of accumulation and path of preparation, the realization is conceptual. It's a conceptual realization of emptiness. So even on the path of preparation, when we meditate and have a realization of emptiness, there's still a sense of me, the meditator, realizing this emptiness. But as we move along this part of the path, the sense of duality starts to collapse. Meaning at the end of the path of preparation, when we sit down and meditate on emptiness, this apparent gap or duality between me, the meditator, and emptiness, the object, completely collapses. And then we have our first direct, non-conceptual realization of emptiness, and then we enter the next stage called the path of seeing. So seeing here means seeing or realizing emptiness directly. And what we see here is that we have number 7 and 8. So number 7 says initial direct realization of emptiness, Arya. So we can talk about 2 types of practitioner. We can talk about an ordinary practitioner and an Arya practitioner. So an ordinary practitioner is anyone who has not yet had their first direct realization of emptiness. When you have your first direct realization of emptiness, you become an Arya being. And of course here we're following the Mahayana path, so the Bodhisattva becomes what's called an Arya Bodhisattva. So this is a very significant point on the path. And it's often said once we have that first direct realization of emptiness, we're on a one-way ticket out of samsara. But one direct realization of emptiness is not enough to eliminate all mental afflictions and suffering. We need to continue to engage in this Vipassana practice, to realize emptiness directly again and again and again, many times, each time slowly wiping out more ignorance, mental afflictions. That's what happens on the 4th stage, called the path of meditation. So the word meditation here, of course, is a translation of the Sanskrit word bhavana. And bhavana literally means to cultivate or familiarize. So what we're doing on this stage of the path is we're cultivating or familiarizing ourselves again and again with the direct realization of emptiness that we first achieved on the path of seeing. And you see on this section of the path, it's divided into 9 parts. And together with path of seeing, those 10 sections or parts are called the 10 grounds or 10 bhumis in Sanskrit. And so what we are doing over these 10 stages is we are wiping out more and more ignorance and mental afflictions. So what we see here is by the end of the 7th ground, you see number 9 under there, it says Nirvana Arhat. So by the end of the 7th ground, we have now wiped out all ignorance, all mental afflictions, all suffering. We are now gone beyond samsara, we've achieved the goal of nirvana. But of course here in the Mahayana path, that's not our final goal, because our final goal is enlightenment. And to move from nirvana to enlightenment, remember, we have to get rid of these subtle stains in our mind, these stains of ignorance. So that's what we're doing over the 8th, 9th and 10th ground. We're getting rid of these subtle stains, which are called the cognitive obscurations, again by realizing emptiness directly again and again. We're slowly wiping out those subtle stains in our mind. And then at the end of the 10th ground, we sit down for the last time, directly realize emptiness, wipe out that last subtle stain in our mind. In the next moment, we become enlightened, and now we're seeing the entire phenomenal world and realizing emptiness at the same time. Before that, we're either meditating on emptiness, realizing emptiness and nothing else is appearing, or outside of that, we see the phenomenal world. So we're alternating between realizing emptiness and seeing the phenomenal world. But once we achieve enlightenment, we're doing that simultaneously. We're realizing emptiness and seeing the phenomenal world simultaneously. And so that's the 5th stage, called the path of no more learning, which means now we have achieved enlightenment. Sounds pretty good. So, so this is often the 5-stage model that we see in the Mahayana in terms of the path to enlightenment. We also then briefly, some days ago, looked at what was called Vajrayana or Tantra. So there, of course, they talk about same goal. We develop bodhicitta, become bodhisattva, we strive for enlightenment. And we need to do that through realizing emptiness. But remember, in Tantra or Vajrayana, we're trying to gain access to this deepest level of our mind, this very subtle mind, in meditation. And that's what we do through those 2 stages, the generation stage, completion stage. And in meditation, this is extremely difficult to do, to gain access to this very subtle mind. But if we can gain access to it and use that to realize emptiness, we can accelerate the spiritual path to enlightenment. So in the Tantra Vajrayana system or level of practice, they also have, I think, normally a 5-stage model, but not this one, because they're operating at a more subtle level of mind. But they also have a presentation in Tantra Vajrayana, the stages that we move through to achieve enlightenment. So, any questions about this diagram here?
Question.
Yeah.
This is very high up things. You said you will talk about signs of improvement, or is there anything for the ordinary practitioner?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we need to realise, of course, is that this is not the starting point. I mean, it's the entry point to the Mahayana path, but it doesn't mean if we're not there, we're nowhere. So, if we get to this point, when we get to this point, already we're very elevated on the path. So that's one thing we need to be aware of. And so, therefore, in all the traditions, we have some framework for practice, step by step. And so, within, someone mentioned they'd studied the Lam Rim quite a lot. And so that's one framework of practice. And there are many frameworks within the different traditions. And so in the Tibetan Buddhist system, which is within the Mahayana, then generally you would start with what's called the preliminary practices, which are things like reflecting on precious human life and death, to see the precious opportunity we have, and it's not going to last forever, to motivate us to make use of this life. And then how to make use of this life, and this is now I'm following a little bit sort of the lamb rim structure, but the other systems are quite similar in their structure. So once we sort of start there and really realise what a precious human life we have, and it's not going to last forever, we'll be enthusiastic in wanting to make it meaningful. How do we make it meaningful? Then within the lamb rim they say that we can do this at 3 stages or 3 levels. And the first level, of course, is to simply strive for a good future. And to strive for a good future, then, of course, to do that, the basis, the foundation is ethics. So first, then we start practicing ethics, stop avoiding harming others, and being an ethical basis. So we start there and practice ethics as a basis. And then, of course, even if we practice ethics, we can understand that we're still stuck in this cycle of samsara, that we're stuck in this state of dukkha, so we can reflect on that. This is the first noble truth, of course, and appreciate the condition we find ourselves in, and then start to develop this aspiration to be free of that. That's renunciation. And then, on that basis, how do we become free of it? Then we need to engage in the shamatha practice, and on that basis engage in the vipassana practice, and of course balance that with the compassion wing. So I think as a beginner, then if we find ourselves quite lazy when it comes to doing practice, then I think reflecting on precious human life and death is very helpful to overcome that laziness, to be enthusiastic about doing something. And then, of course, as a basis, adopt that ethical lifestyle. And then I think, particularly for us in our modern society, due to the type of lifestyles we lead, I would suggest that the shamatha practice is one of the key initial practices to really calm the mind, make the mind more clear, calm and focused. And then also, I think, in our modern society, since we have a very strong generally sort of me attitude, that we can start to break that down by cultivating these 4 immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy and equanimity. And I think the thing is that these 2 practices of shamatha and the 4 immeasurables are practices that are not particularly Buddhist, and I think even if we're completely non-religious, these are practices that are just common sense, that we want to, of course, on an ethical basis, develop or cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind and be kind and compassionate to ourselves and others. So I think this is really where we need to start, because what we often find in Tibetan Buddhism, in all the Tibetan Buddhist schools, they all, at the highest level, have this Tantra or Vajrayana. So a little bit unfortunate, what we see is that often when people come into the different Tibetan schools, Tibetan Buddhist schools, one of the first things they're asked to do is these preliminary practices, foundation practices. But the ones that are presented are the ones for Tantra Vajrayana. So often you'll see presented very early in some of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions that we're asked to do 100,000 prostrations, 100,000 Vajrasattva, 100,000 mandala offering, 100,000 Guru Yoga. And of course we look at that and we go, well, what's that all about, you know? Because we think it's like, because it's called Nungdro, preliminaries, but it's preliminary to Tantra, it's not preliminary to practice. But unfortunately that's often how it's presented, and then of course we go, ooh, I don't know about this. And in fact, recently, some years ago, a friend of mine was wanting to really do a longer sort of meditation retreat to establish a good basis. And she'd heard about these practices, but she wasn't so sure about them. And she was very keen on the idea of doing some shamatha practice. So she went to one of the highly regarded Tibetan lamas in Kathmandu, And she asked him, well, what should I do? And he said, yeah, it's true that in Tibetan traditions we have these 4 preliminaries, this prostrations and Vajrasattva and so forth. But he said, I think that for Westerners, we should have a new Nungdro preliminary, and he recommended Shamatha and the 4 immeasurables as the best practices to start with. So I tend to agree with that. I think that, that if we don't have a somewhat more calm, clear, focused mind, we can put a lot of energy into all these other practices but not really get anywhere because we're distracted and half asleep and so forth. So I think this is a very good place to start. And also, again, in our modern society, I think there's this, we're very self-absorbed a lot, and I think we really need to, and often we view ourselves and others in a very negative way, and so I think we need to really cultivate that kindness and compassion to ourselves and others. And so I think if we do those 2 things on the basis of ethical lifestyle, I think we can't go wrong as the foundation. So this is what I would certainly recommend. And then on that basis, then we can look at a particular tradition that sort of resonates with us if we want to go further. And each tradition, even in Tibetan Buddhism, we have 4 schools, and each one really has a slightly different perspective of the path. So I think it can be helpful to investigate different traditions and see which one sort of resonates with us, and then go into that tradition. Because each tradition has put together a package of practices that work well together. See, the thing is, what we probably don't want to do is look around at the different traditions and go, oh, I like that from that tradition. Oh, that one I like from that tradition. I like that from here. I like that from here. And so we gather, all these things from different traditions, stick them all together, and usually it doesn't go very well. And even they may even cause problems for each other, because these practices come within a package, and each tradition has their own sort of perspective of the path. And if we're combining practices from many different traditions, the practices could actually work against each other. So that I wouldn't really recommend. So best would be to find a tradition that seems to connect to you, that you resonate with, and then go into that tradition. And as a beginning, even before you pick any tradition, I think the Shamatha and the 4 immeasurables practices are universal practices for everyone. So we can put a lot of effort into those as a basis. I think that's what I would suggest.
Well, just about the thing that you said, to choose one, this is a privilege. If you live like in Israel and some Lama, big Rinpoche come and he's from the Kali, so we will go to him because we are thirsty for Dharma. So
sure. So yeah.
No, we don't go because we are going to...
Yeah. So what we can do and can be helpful is that if we have found a tradition that suits us and we immerse ourselves in that in terms of study and practice and know it quite well, what we can do at that point is then look outside a little bit, read some stuff or get some teachings from traditions a little bit outside of that, because that can help broaden our understanding, because usually they come from a slightly different perspective. But what I wouldn't recommend is, as a beginner, to do a little bit of this, 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 because we're just going to get confused and it's not really going to work very well. But if you're established in one particular tradition, it can really be quite helpful to receive a little bit of instruction from some of the other traditions, particularly if they're sort of a little bit related, like the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So that can be helpful. And also, there's often a lot of talk about relying on a teacher. And the question is, of course, do we really need a personal teacher? And of course, the purpose of having a personal teacher is to save us time. You know, if we had unlimited time, we could probably eventually get somewhere without a teacher. But the reality is we don't have unlimited time. So we want to make most use of our time, most effective. So a personal qualified teacher, of course, can give us, not only give us very precise instructions suitable to us as an individual, because, you know, in the tradition we have a very big general framework, but, you know, where am I and what should I focus on and which is more important and so forth, we don't really know. But a teacher can really tailor the path specifically for us and give us specific instructions about what is best for us to do now. But how we relate to that teacher, and I'm talking personal teacher, is that generally it's recommended that we only have one personal teacher. We can receive teachings from a number of different teachers, but if we have more than one teacher we get personal advice from, there's very much a danger that there's very much a danger of two things really. One is that what can often happen is that we go to a teacher for personal advice, and often the very instruction that they give us is the one thing we don't want to do because it's the one thing we really need to work on. And we hear that and we go, oh, I don't like that. Then we run off to another teacher and they may say the same, and we go, oh. And then you keep running until you find a teacher that says something nice. We go, oh yeah, I'll do that. That's not in our best interest. And the other difficulty is if we get personal instruction from different teachers is that if two teachers give us seemingly contradictory advice, what do? Confusion. So best to have one personal teacher, and if we're going to ask for personal advice, then we better be prepared to follow that advice. If we're not going to be, because often the advice is quite challenging, and if we get challenging advice and we go, oh, no, I don't think I'll do that, then we're not being sincere. So if we're going to ask personal advice, we better have the attitude, I'm going to follow it. Of course, if they ask us to do something which we believe to be unethical, we must not follow that advice. But generally, if we've checked out the teacher and seen they're qualified, that's not going to happen. Usually that only happens if we don't check out the teacher and we just see someone who's very charismatic and we follow them because they seem great, but we didn't check them out. And then, of course, we find out later, well, ooh, actually this person's not very qualified or even ethical. So then we're in a difficult situation. So to avoid that, we need to check them out. And also in terms of, but then we say, well, but there's no many qualified teachers where I live or in my country even. I think there we need to have our relationship to the teacher. Often the analogy that's given is that like a fire. That if we're too close to a fire, we get burned, and if we're too far from the fire, we don't receive any warmth. Likewise, if we're too close to the teacher, i.e. we're living in the same town or close by and we're seeing them every day, often we can get burned. And we can get burned in two ways. One is that whenever we have a question, we go, okay, teacher can do that. Well, answer that for me. So we run off to the teacher for even little trivial things. And that's not in our best interest. And in fact, if we go to a teacher for trivial, they'll say, go away and sort it out yourself, because we need to become self-reliant. Otherwise, we become codependent on the teacher. And the teacher's job is to get themselves out of a job long-term by making us more self-reliant. So therefore, if we're too close, we see them all the time, there's a danger that we can just use them to absolve responsibility. I mean, I even know someone who's long-term Buddhist practitioner, and whenever he wants to go somewhere, he goes to the teacher and says, what flight should I take? Serious. Yeah. The other way we can get burned if we're too close is if we're seeing them all the time, often we start to project a lot of things onto them which are not true, you know, because that's often what we do in our modern society. Particularly, we tend to project a lot of negativity onto everything and everyone. So we can then start projecting a lot of negativity onto the teacher when it's not really there. But of course, if we're too far from the teacher, we don't receive the warmth, meaning we don't get personal instruction and we don't get inspiration. So we need to have that good distance. So therefore, actually, you know, the teacher doesn't even really need to live in the same country as us. If we can, either by them visiting our country once or twice a year, or we going to where they are once or twice a year, so if we can get to see them physically 2 or 3 times a year, that's probably enough. Because historically, what would happen is that you'd go to the teacher and you'd ask for some advice, they'd give it, you'd go away and try and implement it for some weeks or months, and when you come back sometime later, maybe months later, and say, okay, this is what happened, and they go, okay, based on what you've said, now do this. So there was this like feedback, and it wasn't every week usually, it was over a number of months. So if we, and in between times, if we find some difficulty in our practice, now we use modern technology. We just email them and say, well, this problem's come up, what should I do? So we don't have to live nearby. I mean, historically you did, because otherwise you'd never see them. But now we've got modern technology, so I think this is helpful to have this sort of relationship with a qualified teacher. That doesn't mean, of course, if we don't have a qualified teacher, we can't begin to do anything. We can just receive general teachings from teachers. We can follow the general structure of the path. But having a qualified teacher can really help save some time.
During the path of meditation, each bhumi, the practitioner, when he's out of the session, he's perfect one of the perfections. It's beyond my understanding in this level what he has to do, but especially 2 of them in wisdom, for example. He's already seen he had a direct realization, and he's doing it every session. Now, what does he do out of the meditation? And also concentration is already...
Yeah. I can't remember the wisdom. I think the concentration is that, you know, we talked about many levels of concentration. We talked about Shamatha, the 4 jhanas, the 4 samadhis. I think here we're doing some very elaborate jumping around and mixing, and to really make the mind much more able to move in and out of these various levels. So I seem to remember that's it. And I seem to remember that ethics, this second ground, the perfection of ethics, I seem to remember this, maybe it's not true, but I seem to have this memory of it, that to perfect ethics there is the point where you don't even have a non-virtuous thought in a dream. And that reminds me of a story, a true story. Some years ago, you know, I did all my study, most of my study within the FPMT, and of course Lama Zopa is the head of FPMT. During, I think, my studies, Roger, who is still his attendant, he wanted to sort of tell us a little bit more about Lama Zopa. And he said, so he gave a few examples of stories, and one he said was that one time Lama Zopa was in retreat, and Roger looks after his meals and that, and generally when he's in retreat he doesn't speak at all. So he was doing retreat and Roger was helping him, and it was after about a week, suddenly Lama Zopa spoke to Roger and he said, I have to start retreat again. He's all like, he said, why? He said, I had a non-virtuous thought. That was after a week. And I imagine his non-virtuous thought was something quite small.
2 questions. One, I was trying to reflect on emptiness, and I found out, or remember that you suggested that we should first understand non-permanence.
Yeah, so, yeah.
So but now in this presentation you talk only about emptiness? Shouldn't we go through non-permanence and no self before that?
Yeah, sure. So remember the foundation level of the three marks of existence of impermanence, dukkha, and no self. So yes, we would be working on those practices, and then on that basis we can much more effectively work in the emptiness practice. So we looked at those briefly yesterday, and then today we're looking at the emptiness practice. So yeah.